The air was thick with excitement at the annual Juneteenth celebration in Galveston, Texas, a city known for its rich history and vibrant community. Hundreds of people had gathered to honor freedom and pay homage to the sacrifices made for civil rights. Among the many familiar faces was Miss Alberta Jones, a beloved local leader whose work in advocating for community development and civil justice had earned her respect from all corners of the town. On that warm June day, she stood before an audience of her peers, preparing to address the crowd as she had so many times before. But what should have been a joyous occasion turned into a moment of unspeakable tragedy. As Miss Jones took the stage, her body suddenly gave way, and she collapsed before the eyes of hundreds. Spectators gasped, some rushed to her side, but despite the swift response, it was clear that Miss Jones had died, her life extinguished in the blink of an eye. In the chaos that followed, many assumed the cause was a heart attack, something that, while devastating, was not entirely unexpected given the stress she'd been under. However, what initially seemed like a natural death soon revealed a far more sinister truth. The autopsy results stunned everyone. Miss Alberta Jones had been poisoned. Cyanide, a highly toxic substance, and one that indicated foul play. The question that loomed large now was this: who could have wanted her dead? Who would have had the means and the motive to take such a drastic step? In the days that followed, as the town of Galveston struggled to comprehend the loss of a beloved figure, the investigation would reveal a web of corruption, betrayal, and hidden motives that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The suspicion fell on three key individuals: her business partner, her niece, and a rival activist, each with a personal stake in her death. But the truth was more complex than anyone could have anticipated. And as more clues came to light, the town would have to confront uncomfortable truths about the forces of greed, power, and deception that had long been festering beneath the surface. Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas, is more than a date on the calendar. It is a living reminder of delayed freedom, hard-won rights, and unfinished work. Each year, the celebrations blend music, food, and remembrance, and at the center of many of those efforts stood Miss Alberta Jones. For decades, she had been a bridge between generations, a woman who championed affordable housing, youth programs, and voter education, while insisting that development in the city should not erase the people who gave it life. Alberta's influence did not come from wealth or political office, but from consistency. She attended late-night meetings, negotiated with city officials, and pushed back when redevelopment plans threatened to displace longtime residents. She co-owned a small consulting firm that advised neighborhood associations on how to navigate city planning and grant funding. Through that work, she became a quiet power broker, trusted by some, resented by others who saw her as an obstacle to lucrative projects along the waterfront. Her presence at the Juneteenth celebration was almost symbolic. Here was a woman who had spent her life fighting for equity, standing on a stage built on the very history she honored. Her sudden death did not just leave an empty seat on a committee. It tore a hole in the fabric of the community's leadership. In church groups, boardrooms, and family homes, people struggled to imagine how the work she started would continue without her. for investigators, for journalists, and for those who follow complex cases on platforms like the true crime channel Beyond the Evidence. Alberta's story represents more than a single crime. It is an entry point into examining how power, land, and legacy intersect in American cities. The channel's ongoing coverage of such cases invites viewers to subscribe and stay with stories long enough to see what lies beneath the headlines. As the shock of Alberta's death settled into grief, attention began to shift from the public tragedy to the smaller circle of people closest to her. Within that circle lived affection, rivalry, loyalty, and quiet resentment, dynamics that would soon move from private tension to the center of a homicide investigation. Miss Alberta Jones's life was intertwined with a handful of individuals whose relationships with her ranged from close partnerships to fraught rivalries. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that these relationships held the key to understanding who might have had the most to gain from her sudden death. Each person connected to Alberta had their own story, their own reasons for being in her orbit, and potentially their own motive for silencing her. At the center of Alberta's life was her business partner, Carlton Stevens. He and Alberta had shared a vision for the future of Galveston, one in which economic growth didn't come at the expense of the city's most vulnerable residents. Carlton was a man of measured calm, who often worked behind the scenes to make sure their projects ran smoothly. But his ambitions went beyond their shared consulting firm. There were rumors that Carlton was involved in high-stakes redevelopment deals, many of which Alberta had opposed. He wanted to see certain properties, particularly along the waterfront, developed into luxury real estate, a plan that Alberta consistently fought against. Though they had an amicable partnership, Carlton's interests sometimes clashed with Alberta's, and their differences over these redevelopment projects were no secret. Next was Alberta's niece, Candace All. Candace had always been a quiet figure in her aunt's life, but her connection to Alberta ran deep. She was the person Alberta had chosen to pass on her knowledge of neighborhood organizing, and Candace had worked for years in the same circles as her aunt. However, Candace's life had begun to take a different direction in recent years. She had grown restless, disillusioned with Alberta's refusal to play the game with powerful developers. Candace's business dealings had become increasingly secretive, and whispers had begun to circulate about her involvement with some of the very people Alberta had opposed. As the only blood relative with a direct connection to Alberta's estate, Candace stood to inherit a significant amount of wealth and influence. Yet the relationship between them was complicated. Love mingled with resentment, admiration with frustration. Could Candace have seen her aunt's death as the only way to secure the future she envisioned? The third person at the heart of this case was Jalen Watts, a rival activist who had long been at odds with Alberta. Jalen had once been part of a coalition of grassroots organizations fighting for social justice, but his approach was much more radical than Alberta's. He believed that only direct confrontation with powerful political and business interests would bring about meaningful change. Alberta, on the other hand, was more pragmatic, focused on long-term, sustainable change through negotiation and policy. Their disagreements had been public and at times bitter. Jalen's reputation in the community had taken a hit due to his abrasive methods, and he was desperate to regain the respect he felt he deserved. It was well known that he envied the power and respect that Alberta had garnered over the years. As the investigation would reveal, Jalen had been working on securing his own place in Galveston's political landscape, and Alberta's untimely death might have cleared the path for his ascension. While these three individuals, Carlton, Candace, and Jalen, were at the forefront of the investigation, there were others whose indirect involvement also shaped the investigation. Those who had worked closely with Alberta, her longtime colleagues in local government, and even some of the residents who had benefited from her advocacy, all found themselves wrapped in the complexity of a case where personal ambitions collided with the pursuit of justice. The question now was whether any of these individuals had taken things too far. Was it simply a tragedy, or had Alberta's efforts to protect the community from exploitation finally caught up with her? The lines between personal relationships and professional rivalries had blurred over time, and the investigation would have to uncover how much each character's desire for power and control played into Alberta's death. It was a warm afternoon in Galveston, the air heavy with the sounds of music, laughter, and the scent of barbecued food. The Juneteenth celebration was in full swing, a time when the community came together to reflect on the city's history and honor the legacy of those who had fought for freedom. Miss Alberta Jones, the beloved community leader, was expected to give a speech, as she had done countless times before. Her presence at the event was both symbolic and vital, representing years of tireless work for justice and equality. But this year, something went horribly wrong. As the crowd gathered eagerly awaiting her words, Alberta stepped up to the stage. She smiled at the audience, ready to continue her tradition of inspiring and uniting her fellow Galvestonians. But within moments of beginning her address, her body seemed to collapse in on itself. She staggered, her legs giving way, and then crumpled to the ground in front of a stunned crowd. The celebration immediately shifted from one of joy to sheer chaos. Concerned friends and bystanders rushed to her side, some calling for help, others standing frozen in disbelief. At first, it seemed like a heart attack. The symptoms, sudden weakness, loss of consciousness, were consistent with a medical emergency that could strike anyone at any time. Miss Alberta's age and high-stress lifestyle made it plausible. Yet, there was an oddness to the scene that made people question whether this was really the case. Her collapse was so abrupt, so sudden, that it felt almost too immediate, too perfect in its timing. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and rushed Alberta to the nearest hospital. By then, her pulse had faded, and attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. The medical team pronounced her dead soon after her arrival. Her sudden death was a tragedy, but the initial assumption was that it had been due to natural causes, perhaps heart failure or a stroke. But as the days passed and the shock began to settle, an uncomfortable thought lingered. This wasn't just a tragedy. The people who had been closest to Miss Alberta began to notice small details that seemed out of place. Her business partner, Carlton, had appeared unusually calm in the immediate aftermath, offering little in the way of emotion. Candace, her niece, had been seen quietly retreating from a crowd, her expression unreadable. And Jalen, the rival activist, had been conspicuously absent, a detail that caught the attention of those who knew him well. The warning signs were subtle, but they began to accumulate. Miss Alberta's death seemed to have too many layers, too many questions, for it to be a simple, natural occurrence. And so, when the autopsy results came in days later, they brought with them an even more chilling revelation. Miss Alberta had not died from natural causes. She had been poisoned, cyanide poisoning, to be exact. The community was stunned. What had initially been viewed as a devastating, if explainable, tragedy now revealed itself to be a carefully orchestrated crime. The investigation would now focus on unraveling the mystery of who could have poisoned such a beloved figure and why. The revelation that Miss Alberta Jones had been poisoned with cyanide sent shockwaves through Galveston. What was once believed to be a tragic, natural death was now a murder, and the town was left to grapple with the harsh reality that someone within its ranks had ended a life that had been dedicated to justice and community. The immediate assumption was that the death was the result of a personal vendetta, but as the investigation escalated, it quickly became clear that Miss Jones's death was linked to a much larger web of corruption, betrayal, and power struggles. The detectives assigned to the case, seasoned professionals used to dealing with the grim realities of crime, found themselves drawn into a labyrinth of financial dealings, local politics, and long-standing rivalries. They knew that to find Miss Alberta's killer, they would need to dig deep into the lives of those closest to her. Her business partner, Carlton Stevens, was the first to come under suspicion. He had been the one to discover Alberta's collapse on stage and had remained remarkably composed in the immediate aftermath. While his calm demeanor wasn't in itself suspicious, it did raise a red flag for investigators. Carlton had been working on redevelopment projects that Alberta had repeatedly opposed, particularly a controversial luxury real estate development along the Galveston waterfront. Her opposition had put her directly at odds with developers and property moguls, many of whom had close ties to Carlton. Carlton's financial interests were also a point of scrutiny. Investigators soon discovered that he had been involved in several secretive meetings with developers. And though Alberta had refused to get involved in these discussions, Carlton had been pushing for the approval of a redevelopment project that would directly benefit him. Had his ambitions for the project and the financial gain it promised led him to take extreme measures? The suspicion grew, particularly when it was uncovered that Carlton stood to inherit a significant portion of the profits if the project went through. As the investigation into Carlton's role deepened, attention shifted to Alberta's niece, Candace All. Candace had been close to Alberta for many years, but her relationship with her aunt had become strained in the months leading up to the death. While Candace had once been the heir apparent to Alberta's legacy, a new tension had emerged. Alberta's reluctance to embrace some of the more radical approaches to community change, approaches Candace had increasingly come to support, created a rift between the two. Candace had been present at the Juneteenth celebration, but she was one of the last people to be seen near her aunt before the collapse. While witnesses recalled seeing Candace retreat quietly after the event, No one had noted her exact movements in the critical moments before Alberta's death. Could her desire to control Alberta's estate have pushed her to take drastic steps? The final person of interest was Jalen Watts, the activist who had long been at odds with Miss Alberta. Jalen's public disputes with Alberta were well known. His aggressive, confrontational methods had often clashed with Alberta's more diplomatic approach to community organizing. Jalen, who had spent years pushing for direct action and radical change, had become increasingly frustrated by what he saw as Alberta's unwillingness to go further in confronting the powers that be. His radical views made him an outsider in the community, and he resented Alberta's popularity, which he felt overshadowed his own efforts. What made Jalen particularly interesting to investigators was his long-standing resentment of Alberta's influence over local policy. Though he had publicly denounced her methods, the underlying animosity was more personal. Could he have seen her death as a means to remove a major obstacle to his own rise to prominence? As the investigation unfolded, detectives discovered that Jalen had been in contact with several developers who had been in conflict with Alberta's vision of the town's future. His ambitions and frustrations were becoming more evident, but were they enough to drive him to murder? While these three individuals stood at the center of the investigation, the detectives also began to uncover a more insidious story of corruption within the city's redevelopment plans. It became clear that Miss Alberta's work had threatened powerful interests, particularly in the areas of land and real estate development. The luxury projects that Carlton had been pushing were not the only ones at play. Behind the scenes, influential figures had been manipulating local politics for years, and Miss Alberta had been one of the few voices standing in their way. As the investigation escalated, the complexity of the crime deepened. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward poisoning now appeared to be part of a much larger scheme, one in which betrayal and ambition were at the heart of a struggle for control over the future of Galveston. The question remained, who was willing to kill to secure their place in this high-stakes game? And was it one of these three figures, or was there someone else pulling the strings behind the scenes? The news of Miss Alberta Jones's poisoning reverberated throughout Galveston like an earthquake, shaking the foundations of a community that had long relied on her steady presence and leadership. Her sudden and violent death left a vacuum that no one was prepared to fill, and the town's response to the tragedy was a mixture of grief, confusion, and suspicion. While the community mourned the loss of their champion, the investigation began to expose deep fissures within the very fabric of the relationships that had once seemed unbreakable. In the immediate aftermath of the news, the reactions of those closest to Alberta were telling. Her business partner, Carlton Stevens, was quick to express his condolences, but his response was strangely subdued. While many in the community were still reeling, Carlton appeared unfazed. His public demeanor was calm, almost too calm, as if he had already prepared himself for this moment. Investigators noted that his behavior seemed inconsistent with someone who had just lost a trusted colleague and friend. In private, Carlton had been consumed by his efforts to push forward with the waterfront redevelopment project, and his lack of visible grief raised suspicions. Was his calmness a sign of guilt, or was he simply a man who had grown accustomed to operating in the shadows of power? Candace Hall, Alberta's niece, was equally reserved in her reactions. Though she had once been her aunt's closest confidant, the recent tension between them had created a palpable distance. Candace had always admired Alberta's work, but as the younger generation began to take a more radical approach to activism, Candace had felt that Alberta's more traditional methods were holding her back. This quiet resentment had simmered beneath the surface for months, but Candace's public response to her aunt's death was less about sorrow and more about concern for what came next. She was seen coordinating with family members, quietly discussing the logistics of Alberta's estate, but her emotions seemed curiously muted. To some, Candace's cool demeanor suggested a pragmatic focus on the future, but to others, it hinted at something darker. Could she have seen her aunt's death as an opportunity to seize control of the family legacy? Jalen Watts, the rival activist, seemed to vanish from the public eye in the days following the news of Miss Alberta's death. He was noticeably absent from the memorial services and public gatherings that followed, which raised eyebrows among those who had known him. His absence from such a significant moment in the community's grieving process was striking, given how vocal he had been in his criticism of Alberta. Speculation grew about whether his absence was intentional, an attempt to distance himself from the tragedy, or if it was part of a deeper involvement in the crime. Investigators found themselves questioning whether Jalen's silence was a sign of guilt, or simply the act of a man who had long been on the fringes, never fully accepted into the circles of power that Alberta had inhabited. The community itself was deeply divided in its reaction to Miss Alberta's death. Many rallied around the idea that her death was a tragedy, an untimely loss of a voice for the people. But as the investigation unfolded, whispers of conspiracy began to circulate. Some believed that the poisoning was an act of revenge, while others saw it as the result of a complex power struggle involving business and political interests. The town's collective grief quickly turned to suspicion, as those closest to Alberta were now under the microscope. The loss of one of Galveston's most cherished leaders had not only created a personal void for those who knew her, but also exposed the deep-seated tensions that had been brewing for years. As the investigation continued, the reactions from those who had been closest to Miss Alberta would become more important than ever. Their emotional responses, or lack thereof, offered subtle clues to their involvement, and the search for answers would hinge on how they chose to navigate the fallout from her untimely death. Were they merely grieving individuals caught up in a tragedy, or were they the key to unraveling the mystery that now loomed over Galveston? The investigation into Miss Alberta Jones's death progressed with deliberate, methodical steps. What had initially seemed like a straightforward case of poisoning now unfolded into a complex web of deceit, ambition, and betrayal. Each lead, every suspect, and every piece of evidence brought investigators closer to the unsettling truth that Miss Alberta's death was no random tragedy, but the result of a well-thought-out crime involving some of the town's most influential figures. The first breakthrough came when forensic investigators confirmed the presence of cyanide in Alberta's system. This toxic substance was not something that could be obtained easily, and its use signaled a calculated, deliberate act. Cyanide worked quickly, leaving little time for the victim to react, and it could be administered in various forms, through food, drink, or even inhalation. The question was, who had access to her in those final moments? Who would have had the means and the motive to kill her? The focus quickly shifted to the three primary suspects: Carlton Stevens, Candace Hall, and Jalen Watts. As investigators dug deeper, their lives began to intertwine with the investigation in unsettling ways. Carlton Stevens, the business partner, was perhaps the most obvious suspect. His connection to the redevelopment project along the waterfront had already been established, and it was clear that Alberta's opposition to the project had made her a powerful enemy in the eyes of developers. Carlton had been an advocate for the luxury real estate project, one that Alberta had vigorously fought against. The financial gain that would come from the project's approval could have been enough of a motive for him to act. Further investigation revealed that Carlton had made several questionable financial moves in the months leading up to Alberta's death. He had been negotiating deals with developers behind Alberta's back, and his personal bank accounts showed large deposits that had no clear origin. It was during this time that he had started pressing Alberta to relent in her stance against the development. The pressure had escalated, and the tension between them had become undeniable. When investigators dug into Carlton's communications, they found that he had exchanged numerous messages with developers who were eager to see the project move forward. Messages that had intensified in the days leading up to the Juneteenth event. Candace Hall, Alberta's niece, was another central figure in the investigation. As the heir to Alberta's estate, Candace stood to inherit everything her aunt had worked for, including the family consulting firm. However, Candace's recent dissatisfaction with Alberta's refusal to embrace more radical activist methods had created a deep rift between them. While Alberta had fought to protect the community, Candace had become increasingly involved in more aggressive forms of activism, often working alongside individuals who shared her belief that the status quo needed to be dismantled rather than negotiated with. It was this ideological divide that had alienated Candace from her aunt, and some close to them had noticed Candace's growing frustration with Alberta's leadership. As the investigation continued, it was revealed that Candace had visited Alberta the night before her death. She had been alone with her aunt for several hours, and during this time, Candace was seen handling items from Alberta's personal belongings. The investigators discovered traces of a substance in her aunt's office that matched the chemical composition of cyanide. Though Candace had not been seen near the stage when Alberta collapsed, the connection between her proximity to Alberta in the days leading up to the death and the discovery of cyanide traces raised suspicions. Jalen Watts, the radical activist and longtime rival of Alberta, had his own motives. His disdain for Alberta's methodical approach to activism had been public knowledge, and many of his colleagues viewed him as a disruptive force. He had been vocal about his belief that Alberta was too soft on powerful interests, and had frequently criticized her for her unwillingness to engage in more extreme forms of protest. with his radical beliefs and ambitions for greater influence in the town. Jalen was a prime suspect. It was discovered that Jalen had attended meetings with developers, including some who had business interests in the redevelopment projects Alberta had opposed. However, unlike Carlton, Jalen had a much more direct approach to achieving his goals. He had openly expressed his belief that Alberta was obstructing the progress of the community, which led some to believe that he may have seen her death as a way to eliminate an obstacle. But while Jalen's connection to the crime was murky, there were no direct pieces of evidence linking him to the poisoning itself. His absence from public mourning, his distance from the memorial events, however, did not go unnoticed by investigators, who began to wonder whether his silence was hiding a deeper involvement. As investigators pieced together these fragments of evidence, the story that emerged painted a picture of a community at war with itself. Miss Alberta Jones had been a woman of principle, caught in the crossfire of competing interests. Her death was not an isolated tragedy. It was a result of a struggle for power, for control of the future of Galveston. The investigation was far from over, but the pieces were starting to come together. The question was no longer just about who had poisoned Miss Alberta. It was about how deeply the corruption and greed ran, and who had been willing to go to any lengths to seize power. The consequences of Miss Alberta Jones's death rippled far beyond the immediate circle of suspects. The investigation, as it reached its conclusion, revealed not just the betrayal of a trusted leader, but the unraveling of a community's trust. The powerful individuals who had been directly involved in the poisoning were not only facing criminal charges, but also the wrath of a public that felt betrayed by those they had once held in high regard. Carlton Stevens, whose ambition had driven him to compromise his partnership with Alberta, was eventually arrested. His involvement in the real estate redevelopment schemes that Miss Alberta had vehemently opposed was one of the key motives behind her murder. The discovery of financial records linking him to the developers who stood to gain the most from Alberta's removal painted a picture of a man willing to sacrifice anything, even his partner's life, to secure his place in the town's future. The trial was intense, as prosecutors laid out a case of premeditated murder, driven by financial desperation and unchecked ambition. The community's reaction was mixed. Some were appalled by his actions, while others, who had long suspected Carlton's interests in the redevelopment projects, found little surprise in his involvement. Candace Hall, Alberta's niece, faced suspicion as well. Though her involvement in the crime was never fully proven, the evidence pointing to her proximity to the crime scene and the traces of cyanide found near her aunt's belongings painted a shadowy picture. Her emotional detachment in the aftermath of her aunt's death raised further questions. Had Candace been motivated by a desire to control Alberta's legacy, or had she been manipulated by forces more powerful than herself? The investigation revealed that Candace had indeed been influenced by those who sought to profit from Alberta's death, but the lack of direct evidence linking her to the act of poisoning meant that her trial ended with an acquittal. However, her reputation in Galveston was forever tarnished, and the shadow of suspicion followed her in the years that followed. Jalen Watts, the radical activist, never faced formal charges in relation to the poisoning, though his connection to the broader political and social unrest that fueled the tensions in Galveston couldn't be ignored. His public absence from the memorial services and his extreme methods of activism made him a figure of suspicion throughout the investigation. Many believed his ideological opposition to Alberta's methods of community organizing had made her a prime target for his radical views. While there was no concrete evidence to link Jalen directly to the poisoning, the role he played in stoking the divisiveness that permeated the town's politics could not be ignored. The community's trust in him was shattered, and his influence waned in the wake of the scandal. The broader impact of Miss Alberta's death was felt across Galveston, where residents were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the power dynamics in their own community. The once celebrated redevelopment projects that Miss Alberta had fought against came to a standstill as the town grappled with the loss of its moral compass. The investigation revealed the underbelly of local politics, where money, power, and greed often clashed with the needs of the people. For many in Galveston, Miss Alberta had been a protector, someone who stood up against the forces that sought to exploit the town and its people for personal gain. Her death marked the end of an era for Galveston's social justice efforts, leaving a void that would take years to fill. But the story of Miss Alberta's death is not one without reflection. It is a story of how unchecked ambition, power struggles, and personal grudges can tear apart the very fabric of a community. It's a reminder of the dangers that lie when people's values are shaped by greed and self-interest, and when the voices of those fighting for justice are silenced. In the end, the true cost of Alberta's death wasn't just the loss of a woman who had dedicated her life to others. It was the erosion of trust that would take generations to rebuild. As we reflect on the complexities of this case, we invite you to engage with us. Who do you think was ultimately responsible for Miss Alberta's death? Was it the result of personal ambition, political motives, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and join us in continuing to explore the truth behind the evidence, right here on Beyond the Evidence.